Hello and welcome to Spirit of Truth Church for this talk on the New Apostolic Reformation. What is it? How do we define it? What are its characteristics? So this is what I think people have been waiting for a while, is to actually address the NAR, or New Apostolic Reformation. It is a major worldwide movement, and it is vast in its influence in America. And so I'm looking forward to this. As our primary text, we're going to be using a New Apostolic Reformation, a biblical response to a worldwide movement. And that is, again, we're going to be going through it chapter by chapter. I'll be adding in my comments and my thoughts on it as well. And that is by Pivic as well. And so we are going to go ahead and begin with what is the New Apostolic Reformation. So C. Peter Wagner is one of the guys who essentially coined the New Apostolic Reformation. He's one of the main theologians behind this, and he's coming out of Fuller Theological Seminary. And he said this in his book, Apostles Today, Biblical Government for Biblical Power. Quote, we are now living in the midst of one of the most epochal changes in the structure of the church that has ever been recorded. I like to call it the Second Apostolic Age. And one second, because I do want to get both authors on this. Give me 1 second. That would be Guyvet and Pivic. Guyvet and Pivic are the authors of New Apostolic Reformation, the book that we're going to be primarily using for this. So here's C. Peter Wagner saying that we are now in a massive restructuring of the church. Now I want you to think about this. Again, the title of the book is Biblical Government for Biblical Power. Restructuring the church. In other words, he's saying that what's happening to the church is a fundamental change in government. That the church is no longer going to be governed by pastors and elders. That time is going away. And it's being replaced by apostolic and prophetic governance. And this really is at the heart of the New Apostolic Reformation. And this Reformation has been going on since the 80s. And it has literally transformed churches and cities throughout the world. And they've been very aggressive in evangelism, discipleship, and in spreading their message and their theology, and in enhancing their churches. And so what is it? Well, the New Apostolic Reformation is apostolic because its leaders claim that they're restoring the lost office of the apostle to the church. This office is endowed with astonishing authority, miraculous powers, and divine strategies for establishing God's kingdom on earth. Now let's break this definition down. So it's apostolic. Why? The leaders of the NAR, and thus the leaders of the church, are modern day apostles. Capital A, same as Peter, Paul, and James. Apostles. I'm sorry, Peter, Paul, and John. Sorry, Peter, Paul, and John. They're apostles. This means they have authority over the church. Technically, even if a church isn't part of the NAR, because if they truly are apostles, they technically have authority over it. In fact, part of the movement that this is to essentially reclaim all of Christianity under these apostles. Now, they also believe that this church that they are sort of establishing or kind of repairing is God's kingdom. So they're going to argue that God's kingdom is the church. This is a kingdom now theology. This is a replacement theology. The idea is that the kingdom is passed from the Jews. It is now into the church. And God is restoring his kingdom and building his kingdom, and he's going to use these apostles to do it. Now, I want you to note some very key things right off the bat. Right off the bat, you have a group of people claiming a high degree of authority over the church. That is a major red flag. Second, you have a group of people claiming massive miraculous powers. Another red flag. Now, unfortunately, these are also characteristics of some very, very dangerous groups that have come about in American history. So keep that in mind as we continue. It is also called the Reformation because the movement will completely change the way the church is done, and its effect is going to be as great or greater than the Protestant Reformation. So they're predicting that this movement, this second apostolic age, is going to sweep over virtually all of Christianity, for the most part. Maybe not the Catholic Church, but a large chunk of Christianity. And it's going to fundamentally change it. And here's another quote I like to read. Quote, apostles, working together with prophets, must take over governance of the church, taking the reins from pastors, elders, and denominational leaders, so that God's end-time plans can be fulfilled and Christ can return. Churches that do not submit to the authority of these present-day apostles and prophets will sit on the sidelines as mere spectators. This should have everybody treating this seriously real fast. Their goal is to supplant pastors, elders, and denominational leaders. Their goal is to get their prophets and apostles installed in these positions so that they are fundamentally now in charge of large portions of Christianity. This is a hostile takeover. This is an attempt to wrest all of the church away from the people who are currently there and into their hands. This is extremely dangerous. This movement is one of the most dangerous movements to Christianity in modern day. There's no question. You're talking about actively starting coups, actively wresting power away from pastors, elders, denominational leaders. I mean, this is dangerous. And why? So that God's end times plans can be fulfilled. This is an eschatology. It's kingdom now. And that Christ can return. In other words, Christ doesn't return in his timing. He returns when they, have basically conquered all of Christianity and made it ready for his return. It's very kingdom now theology. And again, churches that don't submit are spectators. This causes division. This causes the idea of second-class Christians. There are serious, serious flaws with this theology, and it is everywhere. And again, make no mistake, this belief that there are modern-day prophets and apostles who are on par with Old Testament prophets and Christ's apostles. That's what it is. And if that were the case, we'd all have to listen to them because they are speaking, or they would be speaking, divine revelation with a universal level of authority. And their argument is going to be that these apostles and prophets were suppressed in the early centuries of Christianity. That essentially, after the office of the apostle and prophet had kind of gone on, that churches kind of got their own views in and said, well, we don't need them anymore. We don't need this thing anymore. Okay? That's the view. And so this then left the church powerless to complete the Great Commission and advance God's kingdom. So they've argued, in some sense, maybe not full apostate, but that the church for at least probably 1,800 years has been in some sense apostate. In some sense, they've rejected Christ's governance through the apostles and the prophets for a good 1,800 years. That, again, dangerous thinking. They then say this, quote, this is C. Peter Wagner. For the first time this side of the initial few centuries of the church, a critical mass of the body of Christ once again recognizes the contemporary gifts and offices of the apostle and prophet. And so when people, again, it's a mind thing. When people recognize it and people give them money and give them influence, then they have the authority and influence. And so their purpose is to raise up an end-time army that works miracles, prophesy, and help the apostles cast out high-ranking superdemons that rule over cities and nations. There's a massive demonic restructuring as well that goes on with this. They also believe in a great end-time transfer of wealth, that God has divinely orchestrated the redistribution of the world's wealth from the wicked to the righteous. And they argue that more than 1 billion souls are going to be saved as a result of all of this. Followers are going to overcome sickness and death and execute God's judgments on earth through the revelation plagues. And quote, any Christians who oppose this movement are under the control of a powerful demon known as the spirit of religion. So if you've ever been accused of being under spirit of religion by one of these people, which has happened to me personally, then this is where it comes from. They say, well, no, you're spirit of religion, you're demonically possessed. No, I just am not going to simply hand over the entirety of Christianity to a small group of people who want power above all else. But this can look very different from church to church. NAR is not an organization or denomination. It has no official listing of beliefs, leaders, or churches. But the baseline definition of an NAR church is the belief in the present-day offices of the apostle and prophet. You are an NAR church if you believe in apostles and prophets in the modern day. Those in the new NAR have established many organizations and intentional networks with one another. So in other words, churches don't join NAR. They are part of networks where the leaders are tied into the NAR, and they teach NAR teachings at the churches. And that's how this works. This is why it's been so, it's in all denominations, it's everywhere. This thing has just exploded, and it's because it's not a denomination. It is sort of a grassroots takeover of churches from within. Now, these aren't new teachings. Fringe groups have been attempting to restore the office of apostle and prophet for a long time. The Irvingites in the 1830s, the Apostolic Church in the early 1900s, the African Independent Churches movement in the 1900s, and Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons claim revelation through present-day apostles and prophets and well, and that is a serious thing. Because we see with Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons, they claim modern-day prophets and modern-day apostles. It's the same thing. And guess what? Those few people have total control over the church, and it is the same thing. It's the same theology, at least concerning apostles and prophets. Prior to the NAR, the largest attempt at this was the New Order of the Latter Rain. And the leaders of this were William Branham, Franklin Hall, and George Warnock. And they taught the manifest Sons of God doctrine, whereby people who received the new apostolic and prophetic revelations could attain a degree of immortality in this life, which would empower them to usher in God's kingdom. Now, this was later denounced by Pentecostal denominations and the Assemblies of God, but the teachings resurfaced in the 80s, with independent, charismatic churches embracing the idea of present-day prophets. And again, people were just absorbed by stories of people like Bob Jones and Wigglesworth. You know, Bob Jones, when he was 7, he walked on dirt road in Arkansas, and Gabriel appeared to him on a white horse and blew a double silver trumpet in his face. An angel threw down an old bullskin mantle at his feet, which he picked up and accepted as the mantle of a seer prophet. These stories sound the same as Joseph Smith's stories, and the same as all these other cult-ish type stories. They sound the same exact thing. They feel very similar. And he became a member of the Kansas City Prophets along with Paul Cain and John Paul Jackson. And then you have Kansas City Fellowship, which was pastored by Mike Bickle, which was associated with them. These guys were also given platforms in the early Vineyard movement. Now, Ernest Gruen, he was a local charismatic pastor who claimed to document the aberrant teachings of these prophets. He found Bickle's church guilty of making errors in oversight of the prophets, and the fact that they established doctrines based on prophetic words. Okay? Now, here's what happens. They sort of try to distance themselves somewhat from these guys, but Bickle and others associated with KCP went on to become leaders in the NAR. So even though they were like, look, you're teaching false doctrine, look, you're doing bad things, look, you're talking heresy, it didn't matter. They were still able to get their platforms. And by 2001, churches have been accepted or approved apostles and formed networks, and that became the NAR. And their teachings, again, are very similar to the Latter Rain movement, but some distance themselves from it. Bickle himself distances himself, but this is doublespeak. As he holds to the restoration of the office of apostle and prophet, I would argue he practices outward deception when he says, no, I don't hold these things in yet. Right in his teachings, you have it right there. And I've seen that doublespeak as well documented as well during my research time. Now, what's the future of the NAR? Well, the NAR has outstripped the Latter Rain movement and shows no signs of decline. In fact, I think not only is this here permanently, I would even argue this has an end times, it does have an end times role, just not the one they think it is. I think the end times role of this is it's going to be part of the apostate church before the end. The people have become so enamored with money and wealth and miracles and power that they will miss the gospel. And we've seen this already through some of the false teachings that have circulated by NAR teachers. They have an entire generation now of young people that promote them. They're flashy, they're hip, they're modern. And these teachings are, again, they're at the heart of Christianity for those that believe them. And the NAR's official Bible version is the Passion Translation, produced by the Apostle Brian Simmons of Stairway Ministries. And he claims that Christ visited him and commissioned him personally to make this new translation of the Bible, endorsed by leading apostles and prophets and followers. and now they can support their NAR teachings by pointing to the Bible. The problem with this translation is that it is a false translation. They make up words. They make up translations. They mistranslate things left and right. It is not, I would not even call it a Bible. I would call it a false teaching. It's a book of false teachings at this point because it does not resemble the Bible. They have so defaced the scriptural word at this point in the Passion Translation that I would say if you have a copy of it, burn it or throw it out. It is worth less than the paper it is printed on because the Word of God is not there. They have so doctored the Word of God. It would be equivalent, the Passion Translation would be equivalent of the Inspired Version from Mormons or the New World Translation by Jehovah's Witnesses. Actually, I would even probably argue it's worse. And this movement, again, is massive. It has substantial political influence. Now, how does this political influence grow? Well, let's talk again. Let's go back to C. Peter Wagner from Dominion, how kingdom action can change the world. And again, no, world changing, not disciples in gospel. It's world changing. We've got to change the world. Kingdom now theology. Quote, "It is important to know up front that this is a massive movement, recognized widely by sociologists of religion, by church historians, and by other scholars as well. It's true. It's massive. It has growing political influence. That's what they're gunning for. It's a worldwide movement. It's got millions of participants. Arguably, it accounts for much of the church growth in the global south, in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And at the current rate of growth, NAR and independent churches are going to overtake Protestants. E.A. Adeboye of the Redeemed Church, Christian Church of God in Nigeria, 5 million people belong to that church. Adeboye was named one of the 50 most powerful people in the world. The Embassy of the Blessed Kingdom of God for All Nations in Ukraine, 20,000 people. Cesar Castellanos, International Charismatic Mission in Bogota, Colombia, 250,000 members. They were featured in Ministry Today. David Youngie Cho of the Yoido Full Gospel Church in South Korea, 1 million members. NAR churches are all over America. They're not always identifiable by their statements of faith, which are very similar to Protestants, but they use the term fivefold ministry. Harvest International Ministry, more than 20,000 churches in 50 nations under Che An of H-Rock Church in Pasadena, California. You have the Apostolic Network of Global Awakening by Randy Clark, Morning Star Fellowship of Churches by Rick Joyner, and many churches and Pentecostal denominations like AOG, Foursquare Church, International Pentecostal Holiness Church, and independent charismatic churches have been influenced as well. Essentially, they use their teachings and invite them to speak. And the Harvest International Ministry offers 3 levels of association. You've got Friends, which are for churches and ministries that are affiliated with denominations. And then you've got varying levels of like NAR church, with the final one being like truly an NAR church. And these NAR revivals, you had the 2008 Lakeland Revival by Todd Bentley. You have NAR books like The Final Quest by Rick Joyner. God TV, the NAR network. You have New Life Church in Colorado Springs uses NAR materials in the small groups like Bill Johnson, Randy Clark, and Doug Addison. And through these teachings and music and more, their teachings enter churches without pastors even knowing. And one journal notes the prevalence of NAR beliefs in the Reformed Church in America and how NAR apostles hold key leadership positions in that denomination. Again, they're influencing and infiltrating these churches. And again, the influence is still there. It's been mostly influential though in the Pentecostal and charismatic churches. And then you also have the appointment of Bill Johnson and Cindy Jacobs to the leadership of Empowered 21, which focuses on shaping of Pentecostal charismatic movement. So they're heavily involved in that. And that's why people now would look at the NAR movement and they would say, well, the number of people who have come into significant contact with it numbers about 66 million people in the U.S. alone. That's a large chunk of the United States. Highly influenced churches, like really deep into the NAR theology, about 36 million people in the United States, and there are close to 3 million people in roughly official NAR churches, networked churches. This is a massive movement. This is way bigger than anything anybody's realized, and it is the reason why we are having so many doctrinal and theological issues in our churches today, because when you actually look at it, the doctrinal divide is typically on the lines of NAR. Now, a growing political force. Well, they have extensive databases of followers, again, through their apostolic networks and prayer networks. And because of their perceived spiritual authority, these leaders exert considerable influence on local and national voting practices. They publish voter prayer guides. And oddly enough, secular organizations have sounded the alarm. They see NAR as a significant force rather than a fringe movement. And most Christians don't even really recognize that it's there, where the secular people are like, no, this is a huge issue. In the 2012 presidential election, NAR leaders organized high-profile prayer and fasting events featuring Rick Perry, the Texas governor, and they called it The Response. It was billed as representing the views of evangelicals. But it's an NAR event, and many took part in it unaware that NAR leadership organized it. You had Doug Stringer, Lou Engle, and the senior staff of International House of Prayer. Okay? NAR leaders, in their quest for political influence, have managed to enter the circles of prominent evangelicals. They have mainstream evangelical influence is going to wane, and NAR gains broader and broader acceptance among conservative Christians. Again, there's ties between Newt Gingrich and the NAR leader Dutch Sheets, the Faith Leaders Coalition. Other events that they've held, the Pray and Act prior to the 2010 midterm election, The Awakening is an NAR event, The Call by Lou Engle is a NAR event, the Day of Prayer for the Peace of Jerusalem, NAR event. Again, they're doing these things to gain influence because they do this and say it's broadly evangelical, but it's really an NAR event. Prominent figures who have participated, you've got David Barton of the Wall Builders, Sam Brownback, a U.S. Senator from Kansas, Charles Colson, Prison Fellowship, James Dobson, Focus on the Family, Steve Douglas, Campus Crusade for Christ, Father Fessio, Ignatius Press, Mike Huckabee, Richard Land of the Southern Baptist Convention's Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, and many others. And essentially, you've got the creation of also this Freedom Foundation. It's a faith-based and policy organization is what it's doing. And it seeks to bring about a spiritual awakening in America by mobilizing Christian leaders to work in every level of government, but again, under the auspice of NAR. Also growing influence in places outside of the U.S., for example, Lou Engle in Uganda. And these tougher sanctions against homosexuality, which you're seeing right now, is part of the NAR influence. So again, what's going on in summary? In summary, the NAR movement is huge. We're talking 66 million people in the United States. We're talking hundreds of millions probably once you get outside the United States. We're talking about major political influence. We're talking about major theological influence. We're talking about it's the music people listen to and play in their churches. It is the speakers they have and come and teach at their churches. This stuff is prevalent everywhere, and their goal is to take over the governance of the church, pure and simple, and to replace pastors, elders, and elders with apostles and prophets of their choosing. And so this is a big deal. And here's the thing. I don't like to throw around the word cult, but I will say this. There are some very frightening similarities between this movement and Mormonism and Jehovah's Witness. There are some frightening similarities between how they put people down and shut people down that resemble disfellowshipping or that resemble ostracization. So there are some very scary tendencies that exist within the NAR movement that are what I will call cult-like tendencies. And so this is a movement that we need to be very aware of, and we're going to be unpacking this movement over probably the course of the next 10 sessions of this. So I think we've got probably 20 weeks of this to go through, maybe more. But we're going to be unpacking this movement and its teachings and its theology as time goes on. So I hope this was helpful. I'm looking forward to discussion. Anyone who's here, I don't see any questions in the chat, but anyone who's here can join in this discussion. I'm going to go ahead and open the invitation now. So you can join us in the Zoom meeting if you'd like to talk more. There it is. All right. Thank you so much for joining us here at Spirit of Truth Church. I hope you have a wonderful evening, and thank you for joining us for this talk on the New Apostolic Reformation, definition, size, and influence. Have a great night.